Story number 1. When I was a teenager, my mom had a strong aversion to driving on the highway. Instead of taking the faster route, we would always opt for the back roads when visiting my grandparents. This meant we passed through a lot of small towns, but there was one town in particular that always gave us the creeps. It was a tiny place, barely more than a blip on the map. No grocery store, no gas station, just a handful of houses, a church, and a community center that seemed oddly out of place, set far away from the rest of the town. Main roads ran near it, but none went through it, making it feel like a place that time had forgotten. We often joked that if vampires were real, this would be their home. Every time we drove through, the eerie atmosphere weighed heavily in the air. We'd rarely see anyone on the streets except for the occasional shadowy figure peeking out from a porch, watching us as we passed. It was unsettling, like we were intruding on a hidden world. There was a huge park with a perfectly manicured playground, but it was always empty, with no children in sight. It felt like a scene out of a horror movie, where the innocent facade of a community masked something darker lurking beneath the surface. One day, my mom suggested we take a little detour down a side street in that town, just to see what was there. Curiosity got the better of us, so we agreed. As we drove down the narrow road, I could feel the tension in the air grow thicker. The houses here seemed even more run down, with peeling paint and overgrown lawns, as if the residents had given up on them long ago. Eventually, we came across a car repair shop. It was strange because, despite its apparent purpose, we had never seen any cars parked outside, not even the occasional vehicle needing repairs. The shop looked neglected, its sign hanging crookedly, and there was an odd silence that enveloped the area. As we pulled up, a man suddenly stormed out of the garage. My stomach dropped as I took in his appearance. His face was not the shape of a normal human face. It was lumpy and misshapen, like it had been molded incorrectly. I knew that some people have facial deformities, and I didn't want to judge anyone based on their appearance. But there was something deeply unsettling about this guy. He stopped dead in his tracks and stared at us with the angriest look I had ever seen. It sent chills down my spine. This was the first real human we had seen outside, in a town we had driven through dozens of times. The intensity of his gaze made my mom's grip tighten on the steering wheel as she quickly put the car in reverse. I felt a wave of panic wash over me, and we both shared a silent agreement to get the hell out of there. As we backed away, I glanced into the rearview mirror. The man hadn't moved. He was still standing there, glaring at us with that frightening expression. I could hardly breathe. The mood in the car turned heavy with unease, and my heart raced as we sped back onto the main road. After that day, I always dreaded passing through that town. My mom and I stuck to our routine of taking the back roads, but we never ventured down that side street again. It became a point of fear for both of us, and I would often look out the window, half expecting to see the man watching us again. Time passed, and I eventually moved away for college. But every time I returned home and drove through the area, I felt that familiar sense of dread creeping back. Even though I hadn't seen the town in years, its haunting presence stuck with me, a shadow in my memory. Once, during a late-night drive back home, I suggested to my friends that we take the back roads for old time's sake. They agreed, and as we cruised along, I felt a wave of nostalgia mixed with fear. When we reached the town, I couldn't help but point out the creepy park and the dilapidated houses. My friends laughed, thinking I was exaggerating, but I insisted that something felt off. As we drove past the car repair shop, I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. I wasn't sure if I wanted to see that man again, or if he was even still there, but to my surprise, the shop was empty, no sign of life, just the fading paint and the eerie quiet. Despite the lack of the man's presence, I still felt a lingering chill as we passed through. I couldn't shake the feeling that the town was watching us. I often wondered what kind of life those people lived in that town and why it felt so wrong, but I didn't visit it again. Story number 2. My girlfriend, a couple of friends, and I decided to explore an abandoned amphitheater in upstate New York, nestled near a mostly empty old mining town. The place had a dark reputation, with local legends claiming it was haunted after several gruesome murders occurred there back in the 50s. We'd heard stories from others about strange experiences, whispers in the dark, and the sensation of being watched. Curious and somewhat skeptical, We decided to check it out for ourselves, thinking it would make for an exciting adventure. It was a chilly fall night when we set out, the leaves crunching underfoot as we parked our car and began our search. The old amphitheater was difficult to find, hidden away among thick trees and overgrown brush. With flashlights and disposable 35mm cameras in hand, we finally stumbled upon the crumbling structure, its once grand archways now cloaked in shadows. As we stepped inside, the atmosphere shifted. The air felt heavy, charged with a sense of anticipation. We could see the outlines of the seats, long abandoned and covered in dust. Moonlight streamed through the gaps in the walls, creating eerie patterns on the floor. We began to explore, capturing pictures as we went. At first, everything seemed quiet, but soon we started hearing strange noises, soft whispers, distant thuds, and what sounded like footsteps echoing in the darkness. Each sound sent chills down our spines, but we pressed on, fueled by curiosity. One particular room caught our attention, a small space off the main area where we found scattered debris and old rotting chairs. As we entered, something unexpected happened. We stood frozen as we watched a few chairs slide across the floor, as if pushed by an unseen force. It was so surreal that we questioned whether we were just imagining things, but there was no denying it. Just as we were about to leave that room, my buddy's girlfriend suddenly screamed, her voice piercing through the quiet. We turned to her, hearts racing, as she stumbled backward, visibly shaken. "Something grabbed me," she gasped, her face pale and eyes wide with terror. We rushed over, trying to calm her down, but she was inconsolable. Her breathing was erratic, and she kept pointing to the back of her arm. With trembling hands, she pulled up her sleeve, revealing a deep bite mark that sent shockwaves through the group. It wasn't just a small bite. The impression of upper and lower teeth was clear, with red and bruised skin surrounding it. It looked as if a small animal had clamped down hard on her, and we were all struck by a wave of dread. "Let's get out of here," my girlfriend said, her voice barely above a whisper. We didn't need any further prompting. Adrenaline surged through us as we quickly made our way back through the amphitheater, each shadow feeling more menacing than the last. The air was thick with tension, and we couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, as if the darkness itself was alive. Once we were outside, we hurried to our car, the night air feeling almost suffocating. My buddy's girlfriend was still shaking, and we all piled into the car, eager to put distance between ourselves and that haunted place. As we drove away, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something lurking in the shadows. On the way back, we tried to process what had just happened. My buddy's girlfriend insisted we look at the photos we had taken inside. "We captured something," she said, a hint of hope in her voice. But when we got back to town, we stopped at Walmart to develop the rolls. The technician took our film, and we waited nervously, exchanging glances filled with apprehension. When the photos were finally ready, the tech handed them over with an expression that said something was off. Sorry, none of these came out," he said. "It's like they were exposed to light or something." My heart sank as we flipped through the blank photos, our memories of the night fading like the images that should have been captured. It was as if the amphitheater had swallowed our experience whole. That night changed everything for me. I had always been skeptical of the paranormal, dismissing tales of hauntings and spirits as mere folklore. But what we experienced at the amphitheater was different, too visceral to explain away. The feeling of something unseen, the bite mark that appeared out of nowhere, and the vanishing photos all haunted my thoughts long after we left. Story number 3. In 2010, a group of friends and I had an experience deep in the woods of Ozark, Arkansas, that still gives us chills to this day. It was one of those nights where everything started out carefree. 5 or 6 of us, all around 16 years old, piled into the back of my buddy's F-150. We had decided to find a secluded spot to hang out, smoke, and enjoy the night. We drove down a back road, way off the beaten path, until we found a random clearing deep in the woods. The Ozarks were a world away from the big city I had recently moved from, and I didn't know much about the wildlife in the area. My friends, though, had grown up in the region, so I figured they'd be used to anything we might encounter. The town we were near was tiny, maybe 1,500 people tops. It felt like we were the only ones for miles. About 15 minutes into hanging out in the truck bed, passing around snacks and a joint, I noticed something odd. At first, it didn't seem like anything to be concerned about. Just a set of glowing eyes, maybe 50 or 60 feet away, staring at us from within the tree line. I squinted through the darkness, thinking it was probably just an animal, maybe an owl or some other creature perched up in a tree. But something about those eyes was off. They were too high off the ground, at least 10 to 12 feet up, and they didn't blink. A chill crept over me. I kept staring, waiting for it to move or look away, but it just stayed there, unblinking, glowing faintly in the pitch-black night. It wasn't like anything I had ever seen, and as I stared longer, I realized something that made my skin crawl. The eyes didn't have pupils. They were solid, glowing yellow orbs that seemed to burn into the darkness. At first, I tried to laugh it off. "Hey," I said, nudging my friends through the haze of stone giggles. "What the hell is that?" I pointed toward the glowing eyes, expecting one of them to identify it or make a joke. After all, they'd lived here all their lives. They'd know if it was just an animal, right? But the moment they saw it, the laughter stopped. Dead silence fell over the group, thick and suffocating. I could barely hear my own breathing. Even the sounds of the forest seemed to disappear. No wind rustling through the leaves, no insects chirping, just nothing. We sat there frozen, trying to make sense of what we were seeing. Then in an instant, the glowing eyes shifted. They went from being 50 to 60 feet away to just 15 feet away, right behind a nearby tree. It was like they had teleported. One moment they were distant, the next they were practically on top of us. There was no sound, no rustling leaves, no snapping branches. Just silence, and those glowing yellow eyes staring at us from behind the tree. Panic surged through the truck bed. One of my buddies, in a bizarre, terrified impulse, grabbed a jar of salsa we'd been munching on and hurled it toward the tree. We all tensed, expecting something, a noise, movement, anything. But the salsa just splattered against the tree, and the glowing eyes remained, unblinking and unmoving, as if they weren't fazed at all. That's when we lost it. We scrambled to gather our stuff, fumbling over each other in the bed of the truck, tripping and shouting in a chaotic blur. There was no time to think, just an overwhelming need to get the hell out of those woods. My friend jumped into the driver's seat and slammed the truck into reverse, tires spinning wildly in the dirt as we tore away from that spot. Even as we sped down the back road, none of us spoke. It wasn't until we were miles away, closer to town, that we started to process what had just happened. "What the fuck was that?" someone whispered, breaking the silence. No one had an answer. We just kept driving, too freaked out to even joke about it. Over the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about those eyes. I kept replaying the moment in my mind, trying to make sense of what we had seen. I started searching online, trying to find any animal or creature that might have glowing yellow eyes. Maybe an owl, or even a large cat. But nothing seemed to fit. Not the height, not the glow, and definitely not the way it had moved without making a sound. I haven't been back to those woods since. None of us have. Whatever it was that we encountered out there, it left a mark on all of us. Story number 4. A few years ago, my ex and I were out in the mountains, trying to find a quiet lake to relax by. We had spent the day driving around, taking random turns on dirt roads and exploring trails without a real plan. Just enjoying the peaceful isolation of the area. It was one of those days where you just follow the wind and hope you stumble upon something beautiful. After a while, we found a narrow, unmarked path that looked like it might lead to water. We parked the car, grabbed our stuff, and started walking down the trail, hoping it would take us to the lake. The forest was quiet, with only the crunch of leaves underfoot and the occasional bird call breaking the silence. As we rounded a bend in the path, we saw a man standing in the middle of the trail. He was alone, whistling a strange, off-tune melody. It was unsettling, not just the way he whistled, but his appearance too. He was wearing shorts and a collared shirt, which felt out of place in the cool mountain air. He noticed us and stopped whistling abruptly. "Hello," he said, his voice awkward and slightly hesitant. There was something off about his demeanor, like he wasn't used to running into people out here. We greeted him back. but I could feel the tension between us already. I decided to ask him a casual question, hoping to ease the weirdness. "Hey, is there a lake around here?" He gave us a strange little smile and nodded. "Yeah," he said, "right down here. Follow me." Something in the way he said it made me hesitate, but my ex and I exchanged a glance, shrugged, and started following him down the path. We figured he was just being helpful, and the lake was probably close by. We walked in silence for a few steps, the trail narrowing as the trees thickened around us. My instincts were nagging at me, but I kept pushing the feeling aside. I mean, he was just a guy showing us the way. What could go wrong? Then we saw it. At the edge of the trail, the trees opened up to reveal a small, quiet lake. But instead of the peaceful scene I'd imagined, the area felt wrong. The lake was still, unnaturally so. There were no birds chirping or insects buzzing, no ripples on the water, just silence. By the shore, we noticed a rundown trailer, its windows dirty and cracked. It looked like it hadn't been moved in years. Next to the trailer was a small dock with an old boat tied to it, and sitting by the dock were two teenage boys, shirtless, messing around with the boat. The boys looked up as we approached, their expressions unreadable. There was something off about them too. They didn't seem surprised to see us. In fact, it felt like they had been expecting us. The strange man we'd been following gave them a nod, like they were all part of the same group. Then the man turned to us and asked, "Are you two alone, or is someone expecting you later?" My heart sank. There was no mistaking the way he said it, calm, casual, like it was a normal question. But the words hit us like a punch to the gut. Every alarm in my brain went off at once. I glanced at my ex, who looked just as freaked out as I felt. We didn't say a word. We just turned around and started walking back the way we came. Fast. The man stood there watching us for a moment, but he didn't try to follow. The silence behind us was deafening, broken only by the sound of our footsteps crunching against the dirt trail. As soon as we were out of sight, we broke into a sprint. The adrenaline kicked in, and we didn't stop running until we reached the car. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking as I tried to unlock the door. Finally, we jumped in, slammed the doors shut, and sped out of there, kicking up gravel as we peeled away. The entire drive back down the mountain, we didn't say a word. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the man or those boys following us. But the road stayed empty, and we eventually made it back to town. Entire time I kept hearing that man's voice in my head. "Are you two alone? Or is someone expecting you later?" I'll never know for sure what would have happened if we'd kept walking. But part of me believes, knows that we could have been in real danger that day. And I'm just glad we trusted our instincts and turned back when we did. Story number 5. This happened a few years ago when I was visiting a mate out in regional Victoria. I've always liked the quiet of the countryside, wide open fields, the smell of gum trees in the air, and the kind of stillness that's rare to find in the city. But there's also something about that isolation that makes you feel uneasy sometimes, like anything could happen out there, and no one would ever know. One afternoon, I went out for a walk along a dusty track near the edge of town. The road was lined with bushland on both sides, and I figured I'd just stretch my legs, clear my head, and maybe spot some wildlife if I was lucky. The sun was starting to dip, casting long shadows through the trees, and the only sounds were the crunch of gravel underfoot and the occasional magpie warbling somewhere in the distance. About 10 minutes into the walk, I saw someone up ahead on the track. He was standing perfectly still, a dark silhouette against the fading sunlight, maybe 50 meters away. Just a random bloke, I thought. Nothing out of the ordinary. As I kept walking toward him, I couldn't help but notice something off about the way he stood. His shoulders were hunched and his arms hung awkwardly at his sides, like he didn't know what to do with them. He was wearing an old flannel shirt and a pair of dusty shorts, your typical bush outfit. But there was something about the way he was just waiting. No movement, no hello, no nod of acknowledgement, like you'd expect from someone passing by on a country road. When I got within 20 meters of him, the bloke did something that froze me in my tracks. Without a word, he dropped down onto all fours, his hands and knees hitting the dirt with a dull thud. And then, God help me, he started barking. Not like a joke, not in a playful way. This was deep, guttural barking, the kind of sound that comes from the chest of a big angry dog. His head jerked back and forth as he let out short, aggressive bursts of noise. I just stood there, stunned, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Then, as if that wasn't strange enough, he crawled over to a bush by the side of the road, lifted his leg like a dog, and made a hissing sound, imitating the act of pissing. I felt my skin crawl. It wasn't funny. It wasn't even remotely funny. The whole thing was too wrong. The way he moved, the way he barked, it was too deliberate, too practiced, like he'd done this before. I locked eyes with him for half a second, and I immediately regretted it. His eyes were wide and glassy, and there was something feral in them, something that didn't belong in the face of a man. It wasn't just weird behavior. It felt dangerous, like he was testing me, waiting to see how I'd react. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. My heart was hammering in my chest, and all I could think was, don't engage. Just keep moving. I didn't say a word. I didn't make eye contact again. I just clenched my fists, lowered my head, and power walked straight past him, my pulse pounding in my ears. As I passed him, I could still hear him barking, sharp, angry bursts of sound that followed me down the track. I kept my eyes fixed on the dirt road in front of me, not daring to glance back. My legs were shaking, but I forced myself to keep walking, each step faster than the last. After what felt like forever, the barking finally stopped. The silence that followed was almost worse. I wanted to look back, to see if he was still there, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. Something in my gut told me not to. I walked the rest of the way back to town at a near jog, my heart racing the entire time. Every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves made me jump. By the time I made it back to my mate's place, my hands were trembling so badly I could barely get the door open. I've been joking about it for a while now, but to be honest, I've never walked those back roads alone again. I think I secretly wonder if he's still out there, waiting for the next person to cross his path. Story number 6. For about a year and a half, I worked as a live-in caretaker for a 94-year-old woman named Marie who had advanced Alzheimer's. She had moved into her daughter's home, tucked away deep in the woods of rural Washington, a place so remote it felt like we were cut off from the rest of the world. I had been working with dementia patients for several years by that point, so I was used to strange conversations and outbursts. Marie had a tendency to talk about people from her past as if they were still alive. She would mention seeing her sister, her mother, and her husband, though all of them had been dead for years. This wasn't unusual for someone with Alzheimer's. Their perception of time becomes fluid, with memories blending into the present. She'd talk to them like they were standing right in front of her, often saying they were outside the house or waiting just beyond the tree line. I tried not to think much of it. It was just part of her illness. What was unsettling, though, was Marie's fear of the woods. From the moment I started working with her, she warned me never to go into the forest. "There are dangerous animals," she would say, her thin voice cracking with urgency, "and you could get lost. You must always stay inside." She'd also fret about her long-deceased husband and mother making it safely through the woods, as if they were still out there, trying to find their way home. I chalked it up to the disease twisting her memories into new fears. About 6 or 7 months into the job, I noticed something strange. Marie started getting up at night. It's fairly common for Alzheimer's patients to experience something called sundowning, where confusion and agitation worsen in the evening hours. But instead of wandering aimlessly around the house, Marie would always go to the same window. She would stand there staring into the dark forest beyond, giggling softly as if she was sharing a private joke with someone only she could see. When I asked her what she was doing, she would smile and say, "My mother's out there." Her voice was light, almost childlike. It was strange, but not outside the realm of what I'd come to expect from working with dementia patients. To her, the woods weren't empty. They were filled with the ghosts of her past. Then one night in the dead of winter, everything changed. The house was plunged into chaos when the alarm system suddenly blared, startling me and Marie's daughter awake. The sharp beeping echoed through the quiet house as we scrambled to check all the doors and windows. None of them were open or unlocked. Nothing seemed disturbed. But Marie was gone. Panic hit me like a wave. We searched every room in the house, but there was no sign of her. It was like she had vanished into thin air. Desperate, I threw on my boots and coat and rushed outside into the freezing night, while her daughter stayed inside to keep looking and call 911. The cold air bit into my skin as I yelled Marie's name over and over, scanning the snow-covered ground for any sign of her footprints. But there was nothing, just untouched snow stretching out in every direction. I spent the next 10 minutes combing through the edge of the woods, shouting her name until my voice grew hoarse. With no tracks and no sign of movement, I started to fear the worst. Exhausted and out of ideas, I turned back toward the house, hoping her daughter had found her by some miracle. That's when I saw her. Marie was standing outside the same window she always went to at night, her frail body framed by the dim light from inside the house. She was giggling quietly, just like she always did when she claimed to see her mother. But there was something deeply wrong with the scene. There were no footprints in the snow around her, not a single mark. It was as if she had appeared there out of nowhere, untouched by the cold or the snow beneath her feet. I hurried over, my heart racing, and reached out to touch her. Her skin was warm, not cold as it should have been after standing outside in sub-zero temperatures. "Marie, what are you doing out here?" I whispered, trying to keep my voice calm. But she just smiled at me, her eyes glazed with joy, as if she didn't even realize she had been outside. We got her back inside, and I sat with her for the rest of the night, too shaken to go back to sleep. Her daughter was equally disturbed, but we couldn't make sense of what had happened. How had she gotten outside without leaving any tracks? And how had she stayed so warm in the freezing cold? After that night, Marie's late-night visits to the window became more frequent, but the giggling stopped. Instead, she began shouting angrily at whoever, or whatever, she believed was outside. She would pound her fists against the glass, screaming, "Leave me alone!" or "Get away from me!" The cheerful conversations with her imagined mother were replaced by fear and anger, as if she was arguing with someone only she could see. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. One night she stayed in bed, quiet and still, and never visited the window again. A few weeks before Marie passed, we had one last conversation that I'll never forget. She was lucid for a moment, her gaze sharp and focused in a way that was rare toward the end of her life. She looked at me with an intensity that sent chills down my spine and said, "Don't let them take me into those woods." I promised her that I wouldn't, though I had no idea who or what she was talking about. After she passed, I found myself thinking back to that night in the snow. I can't explain what happened, how she got outside without leaving tracks, or why she was so unbothered by the cold. I just hope, wherever she is now, that she's finally at peace, and I hope those woods, whatever was waiting for her out there, never found her. Thanks for watching. Don't leave before leaving a like to this video. Also hit the subscribe button to support my work. And as always, have a horrific nightmare, my dear.